Okay, good day to you, and welcome to this talk. I'll give a series of talks on a range of topics, and these are divided into four pieces. In the first piece, I will speak to the contemporary challenges that are faced by Africa as a basis for thinking about how we can expand the role of journalism in society beyond the mainstream practice. And I think this is relevant not just to African people but also to Polish people, given some of the challenges that both our peoples face within a national context and also in terms of our position within the global community. So as an African, I'll give you the context within which to think about how journalism can be expanded beyond the mainstream model, to factor in those aspects that, if covered using the mainstream model or the objectivist approach to journalism, may escape scrutiny, isn't it? So I will start by giving you just sort of some broad picture about the state of affairs on the African continent, and a list or some key social justice issues that preoccupy the continent at the moment, and sort of propose a way forward in terms of how to conceive a role for journalism in society. So Africa is a continent with 54 member states, about 1.2 billion people. It has a growing middle class, but also at the same time it has a very significant number of people that are still living an impoverished life. 40% of African people live in urban areas, and this number is expected to rise to 60% in 2050. Africa is 60% of the world's arable land, 60%, and it received 34 billion in overall direct aid last year, which represents a significant decline from 50 billion which the continent received in 2016, which obviously indicates that there are more issues that remain unattended to, given this drop in humanitarian support, primarily from developed countries. The gross domestic product of the continent is around 3 trillion, GDP per capita around 5,000 United States dollars. The general Gini coefficient of the continent is 0.43. Gini coefficient is a measure of inequality between the rich and those that are struggling. But this is a fairly old statistic. One may want to check with the World Bank what the current levels of inequality are like on the continent, but they're still significant in particular countries more than in others. Between 2000 and 2016, Africa tripled its trade with the rest of the world from 276 billion to 806 billion US dollars. 51% of African exports are raw materials, mostly mineral products or mining products, and some agricultural products, isn't it? But surprisingly, the trade between African countries is, I think it was 2021, I'm not very sure about this statistic, was only 16%. And 80%, and this is in comparison to say 80% intra-European trade. So trade between European countries ranks at around 80% in comparison to only 16% among African countries, which shows quite a very worrying situation there. And of the imports that Africa buys from other places, 63% are fully processed products, and only 12% are raw materials. That is in comparison to its 51% export of raw materials, isn't it? The food import bill, despite the fact that Africa has 60% of the world's arable land, the import bill is at $35 billion and is expected to rise to around $110 billion by 2025. Again, which is a sort of a misnomer that the continent that is the most arable land also seems to be spending more on importing food than any other place on the planet. 70% of workers on the continent in vulnerable employment, contract jobs, and other forms of employment that are ephemeral. And the informal economy in the region contributes between 50 to 80% of GDP, and this differs from one country to the other. In other countries, the informal economy is bigger than the formal economy. In others, the formal economy is bigger than the informal economy. But at a continental level, the rate is between 50 and 80%. 60 to 80% of employment and 90% of new jobs are also in this sector. The 37% of the world is extremely working poor in sub-Saharan Africa, and its poverty rate is at around 41%. So some of the most exigent issues in development on the continent include the following, or we could think of these as some of the more pressing justice issues on the continent. Inequality is a big problem within countries and between countries. The anthropogenic impact of development on the environment is also a major problem on the continent. Africa is actually the worst affected by climate change, and yet Africa contributes the least to climate change on the planet. Migration is a problem within and between continents, so people moving across borders in the African continent are very significant in numbers, and the numbers between continents is also increasing, and we've witnessed some of the tragic events in the Mediterranean Sea where migrants from Africa end up drowning trying to cross into Europe. The same picture is also evident between Africa and Australia, Africa and Canada, as well as Africa and the United States of America. All this is an indication of things not going well on the continent at an economic level. In some cases also because of the impact of climate change, politics, conflict, armed conflict in some cases. We still have hotspots in the DRC, parts of Sudan, and so on and so on. Right? Differentials, gender differentials, and are still significant on the African continent. We shall come back to this topic later on. Differences in terms of the distribution of wealth along racial lines, along ethnic lines, along spatial dynamics between the urban and the rural are very significant again on the African continent. Globalization has had a particularly significant impact on especially the poor who continuously are being pushed into poverty. So I'll just go very quickly into some of the key justice issues that are affecting the African continent, and we'll come back to this in later talks about what journalism can do in response to these pressing issues. So inequality is a very significant, this is the first justice issue that I'm going to speak to. Inequality is a very significant issue on the African continent. The 2020 Human Development Report noted that inequalities are as high within countries as they are between countries. Between countries in particular, those in the global south, those in Africa in comparison to the rest of the world, more so in comparison, say, to countries in the north, in the global north. And these inequalities hurt societies, they weaken social cohesion, they undermine people's trust in government institutions, and also between themselves. The UNDP in 2020 also noted that these inequalities prevent people from reaching their full potential. They make it harder, inequalities make it harder for political decisions to reflect the aspirations of the whole of society and to protect the planet, as the few pulling ahead flex their power to shape the decisions that primarily serve their interests at the expense of ordinary people. And inequalities in Africa in particular have been noted as a significant barrier to the achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development by the United Nations. So, while many people have been extricated from the grip of poverty, widespread differences remain. The gaps are still unacceptable between the haves and the have-nots, and emerging forms of inequalities are also coming up, and this is in particular reference to especially competencies in digital skills, access to digital technologies, and so on, which are sides through which particular people who lack the skills, who lack the resources to be integrated into the digital economy find themselves falling outside the mainstream economy and worsening their situation as a result, isn't it? Also, inequalities in Africa, they have manifested themselves as having a multiplier effect. Which is to say that once one member of the family is trapped in poverty, that cycle of poverty keeps reproducing itself, pushing people who are already impoverished further into poverty, and this is transmitted from one generation to the other, thereby also increasing the numbers of people that are trapped in this situation. In some cases, the experience of inequality starts before birth for those born into poverty. Lack of access to health facilities, lack of access to education, and so on and so on, sort of keep pushing these people into poverty, isn't it? Some points to ponder in terms of the anomalies around the distribution of economic resources across the world. The world is billionaires, which are only about just above 2,000 in 2019, had more wealth than 4.4 billion people on the planet. The combined wealth of the world is 22 richest men in particular, is more than the wealth of all women in Africa. The world is richest 1% according to Oxfam in 2020. Is more than twice as much as that of 6.9 billion people on the planet. And it has also been shown that just taxing an additional 0.5% of the wealthy 1% on the planet can generate enough resources or investments to create around 117 million jobs in education, in health, elderly care, and so on across the planet. The monetary value of unpaid care work by women aged between 15 or from 15 years and over is also estimated to be around 10.8 trillion annually, according to Oxfam. So this brings me to the next key justice issue, which is the global gender gap. Also a very, very significant one, according to the World Economic Forum in 2020. Some of the key issues to take note of in respect of the gender gap are that despite some improvements, there is still a 31.4% average gender gap that remains to be closed globally. And the major area around which this is manifested is in the economic participation, opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, as well as political empowerment of women. So women are mostly excluded in those within the economic participation and opportunity bracket, although they are also disadvantaged across those other areas: educational attainment, health, and survival and so on. And the WEF also knows that projecting current trends into the future, the overall global gender gap will close in 99.5 years. That is if we maintain the current trends in terms of transformation that is going on, meaning that women are likely to remain experiencing injustice for at least a century. In some places even for longer than that. 55% of women are in the labor market versus 75% of men, which again shows the persistence of the gender gap. Some of the projected trends are that in sub-Saharan Africa it might take about 95 years for the gender gap to be closed. Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and this I assume also includes Poland, the projection is around 107 years, 140 years in the Middle East and North Africa, 151 years in North America, and 163 years in East Asia and the Pacific. So this is not a very good picture in terms of women's experience of injustice, where we are and where we are going. The next key justice issue that is affecting the continent is climate change, which is now a global problem. But this global problem affects Africa more than any other part of the world. The mean temperature rise for Africa at the moment is around 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial times, which has been a significant contributor to the frequency of droughts and the severity of the droughts that are experienced in Africa. And this is expected to get worse as we go into the future. And the major source of climate change in Africa is the clearing of land for agriculture and also vehicular emissions. They have also been noted as a major source of pollution in Africa. So between 1975 and 2000, the size of agricultural areas increased by 57%, which shows the severity of such clearing. Every African country is vulnerable to desertification. The increase in agricultural production in Africa is still based on the clearance of cropland, which means the chances of this problem getting worse are also very high. What else? Population growth is also likely to be a source of challenges in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and by 2050 the population of sub-Saharan Africa is expected to double. Migration, which is also directly linked to the condition of development on the continent, is also another big problem. Although immigration from the continent regularly takes place, about 80% of Africa's migration is still within Africa rather than between Africa and other parts of the world. So more than 30% of all forcibly displaced people also reside in Africa, including 6.3 million refugees, asylum seekers, as well as 14.5 million internally displaced people. The majority of internally displaced people are women and children who come from already marginalized groups. Democracy and development is also another issue to be analyzed in Africa. There are still many problems, although there have been developments. The pandemic has sort of rolled back some of these developments in some places where stricter forms of administration and political organization have been put in place on the basis of controlling the movement of people and the spread of the disease. Urbanization is also likely to be a major source of problems going into the future. Levels of urban poverty, inequality and segregation remain very high on the continent, and also urbanization is at the moment on the rise in Africa. A report by the Finnish government in 2019 noted that urban poverty is concentrated in slums and shanty towns where poor or non-existent sanitation, waste management, energy provision, healthcare, and other services expose inhabitants to the risks of crime, disease, violence, and overall poverty, isn't it? The inevitable impact of climate change, such as storms, floods, may also have a catastrophic impact on these already marginalized people, right? The accelerated adoption of technology may also exacerbate already existing inequalities between genders, between the rich and poor, and so on. And climate change is also expected to worsen migration in particular, and so on. So if we look at this picture, what is evident is that social problems are becoming much more severe, although they are reducing in terms of the number of people that are trapped in poverty, but the intensity of the problems is much more severe than it has been at any other point in time. And one has to ask about whether or not the current practices of journalism are bringing up these issues in the most effective way. In this series of talks, I'm going to propose a different way of thinking about the role of journalism in addressing problems of social justice in society. So in my next talk, I will introduce you to decolonial thought as a framework for thinking about the challenges of people in the global south, and by which we don't just mean people in Africa and other parts of the former colonized world, but people in the global north who are also excluded from the mainstream economy, and so on. Thank you for joining me on this talk.